Okay, I think we're at 37 participants. I think more people will be filtered in, but we've reached a quorum where we can begin. So I'll start off the preliminary introductions. Welcome everyone out there, wherever you are across the United States and Canada and the UK and beyond. I'm Colin Webster from UC Davis. I'm the current president of the Society for Ancient Medicine and Pharmacology, and I am delighted today to open up this event, Reorienting Ancient Medicine, with Eileen Dawes and Jay Crisostomo. This is also sponsored by the UC Davis Early Science Workshop. So welcome to those of you who are joining us from UC Davis. At this point, I'm going to turn it right over to Eileen, who's going to give a short introduction for both her and Jay, and then sort of outline what we're going to do for the proceedings. So I'll turn it over to you and then turn off my camera.
Cheers, Colin. So just to reiterate, Colin's welcome. Welcome, folks, to this webinar that will discuss strategies for integrating and framing material from the pre-modern Middle East into historical, science, technology, and society classes, or STS classes. I should note that this session is being recorded, so it can be uploaded on the Society for Ancient Medicine and Pharmacology website. If you are uncomfortable with being recorded for any reason, especially during the Q&A, please contact either Colin Webster or myself, and we will do our best to acquiesce to your preferences. So my name is Eileen Dawes. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm an associate professor of classical studies, Middle East studies, and Judaic studies at the University of Michigan. I also serve as the director of the Interdepartmental Program in Ancient History. I am joined today by my colleague from Middle East Studies, Jay Crisostomo, an associate professor of Assyriology, who will help me facilitate this session. Before we get things started, I want to acknowledge that today is Earth Day, which calls on us to reflect on our commitment to the land that we inhabit and to the peoples who have historically stewarded that land. To that end, I feel that it's important as an employee of the University of Michigan to recognize that this institution's origins derive from a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi people, as well as the Wyandot. Like almost all property in the US, this land was obtained generally in unconscionable ways. With this statement, I ask us all to keep in mind these community struggles for self-determination and the colonial legacies of scholarly practices. So to return to the topic at hand. So Jay and I envisioned that our conversation, and we would like to keep it informal, so we're calling it a conversation, will last for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will welcome questions from you, the participants of this webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will ask you to unmute yourself, or you can also, of course, type your question into the chat. We also have a Q&A function, so either kind of ways we welcome. Jay and I base the following remarks on our experiences as researchers interested in the pre-modern Middle East. Jay investigates cuneiform cultures during the third and second millennia BCE, especially Sumerian language and literature, whereas I study medieval Islamicate responses of Greco-Roman medicine and philosophy, responses to Greco-Roman medicine and philosophy. And we also base this as kind of teachers of ancient STS classes. So perhaps to start things off, can you, Jay, perhaps give us a short overview of how you involve the Middle East into your teaching? Or to put it more simply, what do you cover in your STS courses?
Thank you so much, Eileen. And just to add to what Eileen has said, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be here and talking about STS in the Middle East, and especially the pre-modern Middle East. My pronouns are he, him, his. So yeah, how do I talk about the Middle East in my STS courses? Part of it is, it's easy for me. I'm in a Middle East Studies department. But I have had to make a concerted effort to talk about the pre-modern Middle East and science and technology. So I teach two main courses in science and technology, or STS courses. One is a course with a title that I'm very, very proud of, probably one of the best things I've ever done, which is Madness, Medicine, and Magic in the Middle East. So this is a course that covers medicine throughout the history of the Middle East, so the traditions, the practices, everything we can get our hands on. So most of what I'll talk about today is deriving from my experiences in that. I also teach a course on science and technology in the ancient Middle East, which focuses, this is a course I've we've developed with my colleague, Professor Catherine Davis, who's an Egyptologist. And so we switch back and forth with this course to talk about, things related to technology, science. So we get to talk about, metallurgy or agriculture or waterworks and stone making, as well as mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. So those are the main courses I focus on to talk about the Middle East and the ancient and the pre-modern Middle East through an STS lens. So yeah, a lot of that, well, we can get into some of the more specifics, but one of the things that I tend to focus on when talking about this are some of these big questions and framing these discussions around things that our students can think about, like what is science, what is medicine, what does that look like in these different cultures, and that helps the students to start to ask these important questions when thinking about cultures or areas or time periods that are completely out of their normal frame of reference.
No, that's really helpful, Jay. And I was going to, we'll get into this idea about doing kind of thematic approaches when we're teaching STS courses. I guess to elaborate on what I teach, I teach a ancient medicine course through classical studies and history. So my primary appointment is in classical studies, even though I primarily work on Islamic materials. So this course, standardly covers I guess the bulk of it, Greco-Roman medicine. And so I guess I have to do a little bit more work than perhaps you, Jay, who's coming from Middle East studies and perhaps has a captive audience who's interested in studying the Middle East. So where I start is I think it's really important to bring in material such as ancient Mesopotamia. And I've had the pleasure of having, Jay guest lecture for me because we have this kind of range of kind of experts on the pre-modern Middle East on campus. So to come and give a lecture on ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt. And then I often end my course looking at the medieval Islamic world. And particularly when I'm thinking about this earlier material that Jay, that you cover, I think is important as somebody who's teaching in classical studies to introduce this material to counter this idea of the Greek miracle narrative, that this idea that the Greeks came up with philosophy and medicine, and that, this is their kind of gift kind of to the Mediterranean world. So I think it's important to kind of introduce this material to show that, there are cultures that, pre-exist the Greeks who are considering many of the same kind of questions about how to understand the natural world and the body's place in the natural world. And I'm, really careful when I introduce this material not to draw a causal link between these ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and say that their importance is because they anticipate or kind of they elaborate some of the raw ideas that we see kind of later in Greek medicine. But as Jay was saying, to kind of talk about how are they dealing with some of the same problems and the same questions? What constitutes medicine? What constitutes science? What constitutes the cosmos? And to think more thematically on that. So I think Jay and I are very aligned to kind of that kind of approach to our STS courses when we're drawing kind of cross-cultural comparisons or trying to think about kind of the broader narratives that we're offering our students. And for me, coming from a classical studies tradition, I had to be very conscious about kind of the way that Greco-Roman medicine and science often, presents itself or has been presented as the origin of Western biomedicine, and how that marginalizes and reduces the contributions of other kind of cultures, not to Western biosciences, not seeing it as the end of kind of our study, but this rich discussion of the variations of what kind of science and medicine can be. And so kind of building on that, we've begin to talk about this is A second question I had, I wanted to talk with Jay was, how do you, Jay, think standard ancient medicine and STS courses tend to marginalize or reduce pre-modern historical actors from the Middle East? Because, yes, I guess you're working from a Middle East studies tradition, but you're very aware of kind of, even as somebody who's working on ancient Mesopotamia, about how these cultures have been presented, and particularly within a Western colonial frame. So could you unpack a little bit how you think, standard ways that these, cultures have been presented tend to kind of reduce or marginalize them?
Yeah, you've already touched a lot on it. There's definitely the Greek miracle idea. So I want to reiterate that I appreciate that you start your conversation not in Greece and Rome, not in the Mediterranean, but elsewhere, just from a diachronic perspective of, this was happening as well. So yeah, there's definitely this tendency when we get to ancient STS to focus in on Greece and Rome as though that is where philosophy, where medicine, where big ideas start, right? And some of that is our tradition, our Western tradition that, as you said, has colonialized, orientalized the Middle East and made it something very foreign, very other, very exotic, but not Western enough to be appreciated. So when we think about, doing these kinds of STS courses, I think that's one of these things that needs to be emphasized of. Biomedicine isn't the be all end all, and to emphasize this idea that medicine is this cultural phenomenon that can shift and change and is fluid. And we might find, later on that ideas about medicine might be more familiar from the ancient Middle East or from the medieval Middle East than they are from Greece or Rome, or we might even insert things like Chinese medicine or Central American medicine, or and talk about these different traditions of healing and thinking about the human body, because that is one thing that we can all talk about, is that all these cultures are dealing with human bodies, which for the most part hasn't changed a whole lot, and so that's something we can all think about, rather than saying, well, how did we get to where we are today? So this kind of teleological evolutionary approach to medicine that sees us, in the Western world, i.e. The United States, in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, as the penultimate of human achievement. And that's just something that we have to consciously avoid. And it doesn't start in Greece, it doesn't start in Rome. And it really doesn't start in the Middle East per se. It doesn't start. It just is something for us to think about.
No, that's really helpful, Jay. I think, I think those who teach STS courses, a lot of our textbooks are coming from this tradition where it's trying to be originalist and, tracing this very kind of neat chronology that, looks at, perhaps, if they kind of reach further back than, Greece and Rome, they're trying to kind of trace about, this is this one idea, this is how kind of humoral medicine, for instance, is anticipated kind of in this culture and then gets passed on. And I think I see that particularly kind of visible in my area of expertise, which is kind of the medieval Islamic world, where I'm especially troubled by how textbooks on ancient medicine define the significance of medieval Islamic actors in terms of their preservation of Greek scientific works, sources to be mined to recover a lost Greco-Roman past, or transmission of this classical past to Western Europe via Latin versions of Arabic monographs, compilations, or translations. For me, such narratives not only subsume these historical actors into a very oversimplistic Eurocentric history of Western progress, but also neglect the creative uses to which these actors put their sources in realizing their own scientific projects. So this is kind of the issue that I have, when we're kind of framing this, is that, we're prioritizing what is so-called familiar, to a Western audience, without kind of realizing that, these ideas or these different paradigms are being developed to kind of understand kind of their own world, to have debates with each other or with kind of with other cultures. And, this is some of the thing that I get really distressed about, because it's an easy narrative to understand when you're doing this original, or maybe particularly for students who are, I'm sure like you, Jay, that you get a lot of STEM students in your course, kind of who haven't taken a historical class before, who perhaps kind of are looking to kind of med school and are privileging kind of science in a way that doesn't interrogate, as you say, its cultural constructedness, that it's cultural variation, that, there is one kind of monolithic conception of medicine, and it's about how you get to that kind of thing. So I think when we're both thinking about our courses, is trying to avoid that kind of simplistic kind of narrative, which is really hard to do at times because our sources, our textbooks kind of reiterate that. So, perhaps kind of related to that is, could you give some advice on how teachers who are perhaps new to Middle East studies can frame this material? So we've talked a little bit about that. And what are the narratives that they should try to avoid when introducing pre-modern science in the Middle East to their students? So just a little bit of advice about, if we have kind of a captive audience who are like, I'd like to kind of introduce the Middle East, but how do I do this?
Yeah, there's so much stuff for us to be thinking about here, right? So, I mean, we've already talked about avoiding this idea of, teleological practice of medicine or science. We've talked about avoiding this idea of the Greek miracle of the kind of the Greek-centric world, which is very difficult to avoid. So even in things written by specialists in Mesopotamian studies, in Mesopotamian medicine, you get this constant desire to compare what's happening to what's happening in the Greek world. So, I just assigned my students in my science and technology course this lovely little overview of Babylonian medicine written by my colleague Mark Geller in the Cambridge History of Science. And it's a lovely overview, but it starts and ends with Herodotus, right? And Herodotus's depiction of Babylonian medical practitioners and the questions that, Herodotus's audience might be asking about what is going on in Babylonia. And it's comparing Babylonian medical practices to Greek medical practices. So from the off, this overview sets it up as though there is something to be compared there, which isn't bad, right? As he's mentioned, it is this desire to present something familiar, to present an idea that students might have, a little bit more connection with, even though maybe I might question whether anybody working in STS studies really knows more about Greek medicine than they do about Babylonian medicine, but that's a different thing. But yeah, those sorts of narratives are difficult to avoid. And the other narrative that I think we should be conscious of is this idea that we know anything about actual medical practice, right? So when we think about contextualizing Babylonian medicine, when we think about contextualizing Middle East medicine in general, up until pre-modern Middle East medicine, most of our sources are coming from particular spaces, particular social worlds that have very little, if anything, to do with what might have been happening, in whatever doctors, healers world, right? And so there is this tendency for us to construct these ideas about, well, we've got medicine on this one hand, and we got magic on the other hand, and these don't coexist, or they do coexist, or you have healers who go to their patient's house and they observe the patient's symptoms and pull out their cuneiform tablet and turn to the diagnostic handbook, chapter 34, and check the symptoms against this. That none of that is in any way realistic, and that's something we should admit at the forefront and say what we can talk about is, for the most part, are scholarly practices of medicine or theoretical conceptualizations of what medicine could be. And so in terms of framing, a lot of what I do in talking about Babylonian medicine and talking about Babylonian science is discussing Babylonian scholarly practices, right? So this is where I admit that I am not a specialist in Babylonian medicine. My specialization is primarily in language and in intellectual history. And so for me, I push this idea that we need to talk about scholarship and think about what Babylonian scholars are doing, what Babylonian scribes are doing when they talk about medicine, and look at it in those terms, look at it through that world. So medicine, for example, most of our medical texts are presented as omina, as scholarly lists of omina, whether that be physiognomic omens or diagnostic omens. They're set up as lists of scholarly lists that are trying to present every single possibility, which is a deep tradition in cuneiform, something that I could talk about all day long. But this is the kind of world that most of our medical texts come from for the ancient Middle East. And so things like that are very important to set up when we talk about these things, and to recognize we don't know much about what they're actually doing. And so we can talk about things like theory and practice, right?
No, I think that's a really good point about talking about the limitation of our sources, and also the variety within kind of the worlds that we're studying, that we only get a very kind of slim idea kind of the different practices, the different forms of medicine that are operating within even one culture, let alone kind of across kind of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. This is something that I very much emphasize when I'm working on or teaching students about medieval Islamic medicine, that, there's a lot of the material in our handbooks kind of, and I guess our textbooks, and also even the sources that survive are so kind of Greco-Roman humoral based. That's only one paradigm with which they were working and trying to understand the body and the world around them, even though that's the paradigm that gets the most focus on, probably because of its links to the Greco-Roman past, versus, that we have kind of translations of Syriac medicine, Persian medicine, Ayurveda, let alone kind of also other indigenous practices like prophetic medicine. And so it's talking about that there is a variety even within the culture, that Greco-Roman medicine is only one discourse that, authors can kind of latch onto to kind of explain or explicate their own bodies, their patients' bodies, and the world around it. So really kind of talking about the variety of different forms of medicine, even within cultures, let alone kind of cross-cultural comparison. So I think this is kind of a really good point to kind of make sure, again, kind of, I guess the theme is, getting away from these monolithic conceptions kind of history of medicine, and really being okay with kind of variation and plurality, across kind of, cultural as well as kind of within a culture. So, related kind of to pedagogical resources, so I'm aware that this, what we're talking about might seem very daunting to those of our audience who don't have specialist training in the areas that we do. So perhaps you could talk, Jay, a little bit about what might be a good starting point for them to engage with this Middle Eastern material. So that you could talk about, resources, scholarly resources, kind of textbooks that use, I know you mentioned the Cambridge kind of, it was a Cambridge Companion or Oxford Handbook of Science?
The Cambridge History of Science.
Okay, okay. So I always get kind of them blended up, but language resources, kind of also kind of pedagogical resources, just explaining a little bit what you use or what you would recommend.
Yeah. So even just thinking about Babylonian medicine, this whole entire thing is extremely daunting, as you say, right? So we're talking about 3,000 plus years worth of history, especially if you add in prehistory or pre-written history to this equation when you're talking about things that have been discovered through archaeology, or recent studies on DNA on mummies and things like that from the ancient world. So this is certainly daunting, and so nobody's expected to know it all. This is one of the difficulties of teaching or studying Babylonian medicine, is even the specialists, nobody agrees on with anybody else on just about anything, right? So if you talk to one colleague, you'll get one answer about who's practicing medicine, and you'll talk to another colleague, you might get a different answer, or things like that. So my recommendation on this, and this is the tack I've taken myself, is to find that area that you can relate to, that you can talk about. So for me, it was intellectual history, to start dive in from that point of view and think about the broader STS ramifications. So, for this audience, if STS is something that you're more familiar with, to start with these big questions, right? Of what is science? What is medicine? How do we think about these bigger ideas about rationality? Is that something you could talk about things like medicine and magic, if there's a dichotomy there, that sort of thing. Maybe somebody's approach is to think about women's medicine or women's health. There are a number of wonderful scholars working on this material. I can direct you to my colleagues, Dr. Ulrike Steinert or Dr. Erica Coates Ferreira. Both of them are working on women's medicine and Babylonian medicine. We can think about looking at the actual sources, if that's something you're more familiar with, in terms of thinking about reading texts and kind of trying to deduce things about medicine from that. So there is a source book of ancient Mesopotamian medicine written by my colleague Joanne Skurlock, which is a hefty volume with English translations of many examples of Babylonian medical texts. And obviously it's not perfect, but it is available. And many institutions probably have access to it through the ACLS Humanities ebook initiative, or whatever it's called. In terms of a basic textbook, again, not perfect, but it's something that's useful to introduce students to the basic ideas, the basic questions, the basic problems. Mark Geller has written a book, Ancient Babylonian Medicine, 2010, from Wiley Blackwell. It's a pretty simple, small book. Again, just kind of introductory. If that's too much, there is the overview by Mark Geller that I just mentioned in the Cambridge History of Science. There are a number of other resources available, especially, over the past year, I've been lucky enough to discover so many of these talks or things that we can give to students as well. So things like my colleague, Dr. Moody Al-Rashid, has a Twitter feed, which is incredibly popular. And, she talks about things like depression in Babylonian sources, or medicine in general in Babylonian sources. And it's well worth looking at that and, giving students something like that to look at, which might be different. For the general question of science and the history of science in ancient Mesopotamia and the object of scientific inquiry, I would highly recommend Francesca Rockberg's Before Nature from Chicago, 2014, I think. This is a wonderful book that sets up these STS questions and thinks about what is the evidence for STS, science, technology, medicine, less medicine, to be honest, and more astronomy or just general STS thinking from ancient Mesopotamia. If your angle is pharmacology, right? So this is the Society of Ancient Medicine and Pharmacology. My colleague at Case Western, Madalena Rumer, is working on things related to sorry, what is it called again? Dracopotheke and pharmacology from that perspective. And her work's been funded by the ACLS and NEH. So that stuff will be available soon, hopefully. Language resources, many resources for studying cuneiform, or at least learning a little bit more about cuneiform languages are available online now. So the major place I would go to in terms of texts with some translations, or at least some introductions to some of this material, especially things like scholarly archives, things like that, would be ORAC. That's www.orac.org. And from that page, you'll find a number of different projects put together by a number of different colleagues, from looking at collecting practices in the ancient world, to specific archives, to things like scholarly letters, which will include things on medicine and astronomy, to medicine, such as the Babylonian and Assyrian medical project there. Learning the languages isn't easy. It's not in Duolingo yet. We'll work on that. So there are a few resources on ORAC that might be useful. And I guess I would recommend, recently, Rebecca Hasselbach edited a volume from Wiley Blackwell, which is the companion to Ancient Near Eastern Languages, which includes a number of, short introductions to various Middle Eastern languages from the ancient world, including Akkadian, including Sumerian. And I'm not just saying that because I have a chapter in there. Yeah, I think there's a lot of other resources, but most of all, Assyriologists, especially today, aren't a scary lot. So please reach out to us. Reach out to me if you want to talk. One of the things I've learned most about medicine is from talking to my colleagues, and learning from them, whether that's on Twitter or through email or from their talks or their books. So feel free to email me, for example, and I'm happy to talk more specifically about any resources or give you some direction if this is a route you want to go.
No, thank you, Jay, so much for kind of listing those kind of concrete resources. And I want to reiterate that if on your campus or wherever you're working has a Middle East Studies department, please kind of reach out, and create, or vice versa in classical studies, like reach out and build these kind of bridges, kind of with individuals. Jay has kind of guest lectured for me. I've guest lectured for Jay. So if you have those resources, that's a wonderful way to have an expert to come in. Whether, for example, you're structuring your STS course in a more chronological way and that you want to kind of start your study or your inquiry in Babylonia, then think about chasing up those resources, or better yet, if you do have an Assyriologist kind of on campus, to reach out to them. And I should say too that the kind of variety of sources that we're listing, it's because there is no one-stop shop, for finding these resources. I wish that was the case. Perhaps kind of one day, Jay and I will write a textbook on STS in the Middle East, where it brings it all together, or even like for me, who works on medieval Islamicate text, to create a reader, for all these sources. So you really have to be a magpie in the sense of kind of picking out these texts. So for example, like when I'm, trying to create my units on medieval Islamicate medicine, besides kind of driving, texts or passages from my own research, what I do is look at a range of different textbooks kind of on medieval Islamicate medicine. I think about Manfred Ullmann's Medieval Islamicate Medicine. We also have Poorman and Savage Smith's Medieval Islamic Medicine, which helpfully has an index with a list of sources and translations, so you can kind of mine that. But unfortunately, folks, there's no kind of one-stop shop, so you really have to get them from kind of secondary sources unless you can engage with the languages itself. But again, just kind of circling back to approach, I think something that you'll get from Jay and I, that we're both really emphasizing the thematic approach kind of when we're teaching STS courses. Again, there's nothing, if you do have want to structure something chronological, is to think a little bit broader in your chronology. Even if you're perhaps not as comfortable kind of talking about this place, it does kind of I guess different cultures like ancient Egypt or Babylonian, is to try, nobody's asking, or your students certainly kind of aren't asking kind of complete expertise from you, but I think ideologically it is important to kind of try to kind of counter these Western centric narratives that really kind of coalesce around Greco-Roman medicine and bringing in kind of the Middle East, again, not as a point of showing anticipation or drawing causal links, but to try to show that there are these varieties of medicine kind of throughout kind of the pre-modern world. And yes, it requires a lot of label if you want to do a thematic approach, but it often you have better conversations and you can draw these kind of broader cross-cultural comparisons, whether, as Jay was saying, that you can bring in like Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, Islamic medicine, and talking around themes like such as religion, magic, the body, physiology, anatomy, these topics like that do require some patience on your students' part who are used to kind of these simplistic narratives, but you do get a richer conversation out of that. So I think what we might do is kind of sort of wrap things up so we can kind of move into the Q&A, but I don't know, Jay, whether you have any last parting advice for our participants about making, well, I guess restructuring their courses, like whether it's a call to action to think about, integrating the Middle East or reassurance, anything that you can do, any kind of advice you have for our participants.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to think about, especially from an STS perspective, is thinking about methodologies over data. That, as you were saying, Eileen, that it's not as important necessarily to make sure that our students, especially for me, I have primarily lower level undergraduates. They don't need to be flooded with every single medical text, right? But I want them thinking about methodologies. I want them thinking about these big questions. And so the framing of your courses is incredibly important. So I tend to spend 2 to 3 weeks at the very beginning of term discussing so many of these issues and dealing with things like rationality. I like to dive into Azandi witchcraft, for example, or talk about paradigm shifts from a Kuhnian sort of STS angle, so that we prepare our students to not expect medicine to be this monolithic or this linear sort of idea, but to be constantly thinking about the cultural ideas that are in place here and to historicize and contextualize medicine or science or technology within the worlds that they come from. And I think that's probably the most important thing when thinking about how to teach these subjects and to teach the Middle East, the pre-modern Middle East, rather than focusing so much on what we don't know or that we're not specialists or something like that. But yeah, this has been a very fun conversation. So thank you for instigating it.
Well, thank you so much, Jay, for kind of participating. So now we want to, I guess, see the digital Zoom floor, webinar floor, to individuals who might have any questions for Jay or myself about practicalities or kind of ideologies about inserting the Middle East into STS courses. So I invite anybody to raise their hand and to ask a question or to throw it into the chat. So I see Colin has raised his hand. So by all means,
I get to cheat because I can activate my video. Yeah, while everyone else is sort of formulating their questions, I'll give them a chance to think through them and write them down. So I have sort of the old comment and a question thing. First is just to reiterate something that you've both mentioned, which is through this UC Davis Early Science workshop, which developed out of an interdisciplinary workshop, the one thing that we discovered is that generally in the humanities, certainly in classics, what we mean by interdisciplinarity is to go out and acquire other disciplines and then go back to our little offices and then use those disciplines by ourselves. And it really was important for us to acknowledge this and recognize that no, we actually cannot learn all of these ancient languages that are required for us to access the materials if we truly want to have these fuller narratives. So it does actually require more than one person to be on projects, and that runs up against tenure, portfolios, and getting jobs in sort of publishing and perishing. There's a whole set of reasons, pressures against that in the humanities, but it is something, if you're able to do it at your stage in the career, it will make your scholarship better, at least. That's what we discoveed. And the second sort of is a sort of more practical question about pedagogy. This comes directly out of teaching an ancient medicine course myself, where I try to include these materials. We only have a 10-week quarter at Davis, so we don't quite have 2 full weeks to be able to talk about this sort of framing, but I do try to start with framing. I will be anti-teleologically explicitly, and then I give them these Hippocratic sources, or we start with Babylonian sources. The Skurlock handbook is one that I use, and nevertheless, students again and again and again, every year that I teach this, seem to immediately pick up on things like, oh, here is magic and here is medicine. Even if I tell them like, no, 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 these type of teleological narratives or these sort of strict dichotomies that we are imposing, and sometimes these authors themselves are trying to impose, are not the thing you're supposed to come away with from this course. They keep really latching onto this. So I'm just curious, aside from instructing them and sort of hammering it home in lecture, are there any particular assignments or practices in the class, any activities that you do that help them come to grips with this? Yeah, period. End of question.
Yeah, I'll let you go with that, Jay, because I'm going to try to answer in the Q&A too. So I'm like, double, I'm not even like double tasking. That's what it's called on it. So please, Jay.
Sure. So I guess the main thing that I end up doing, Colin, is, similar to what you were just saying, is to just keep hammering it home over and over and over and over again from different angles, different things. In fact, one of my students at one point said the class is like Groundhog Day, which, that's fine by me to an extent, as long as they come away from it, with that recognition. One of the more fun things I do, which helps, is I take my students into the Kelsey Museum, which we have here on campus, and let them handle some of these objects, let them think about how these objects were used, and talk about when they have an Arabic magic bowl, for example, what is being done here? How is this being perceived or thought about within these medical traditions? And I think that helps a lot to have that kind of tangible thing for them to go back to. So between that and constantly reiterating how cultural medicine is, that helps. Part of the framing I do is to break down some of the expectations that they have about science, or some of the exemplification they have towards science and rationality, right? So I mentioned I give them a reading on the Azande witchcraft rituals, and have them think about, what is rational here? What does rationality think about here? We deal with, Latour has this reading, I can't quite remember what it is, but it deals with classification of diseases, right? So it's about the autopsy of Ramses II performed in France, where they decided he died of tuberculosis. So we deal with questions about classification. On that note, by the way, classification, there is a wonderful volume edited by Ulrike Steiner. It is called Classification in, it is called Systems of Classification in Pre-Modern Medicine. That's from Rutledge. I believe it's even open access. And there are a number of chapters in there that get at some of these questions and get at some of these ideas that we're presenting here in terms of thinking more thematically, or thinking about some of these deeper underlying issues. So I would highly recommend that. And that comes from all sorts of different cultures, written by experts in those fields. Yeah, anything you want to add to that, Eileen?
Yeah, I would just say, kind of before we move on to some of the other questions, is that I often kind of do translation exercises, in the sense that I am, because I'm working often in, reimaginings of Greco-Roman medical ideas by Islamic actors. And so I often kind of, when there's available, is to look at a Greek source and the way that it's been translated and transformed by Islamic actors. I think, a good example of that is the Hippocratic Oath. So so looking at the Arabic translation and that kind of the way that it's been adapted is a good way to start discussing that translation isn't about fidelity. It is about kind of making a text legible or comprehensible to a certain context. And so I often do when it's possible, like for my class now, I'm teaching on the Mediterranean. I've looked at kind of Ptolemy's theory of the climes and looking at it, I guess, expressed or kind of transformed in a anonymous book called the Book of Curiosities, like an 11th century Egyptian text, written in Arabic. So I like to kind of pair these sources together and to have the students kind of spot the ways that these have been kind of transformed and, really kind of considering and pushing what translation means. I think particularly those coming from the, classical tradition, or even also kind of Assyriology, kind of translation is often about kind of how can you convey something kind of accurately, this idea about accuracy, which just doesn't hold with pre-modern translations, and I would say just translation period. So just even a little bit of translation theory going there. But okay, so maybe moving on to another question. So thank you, Colin. So I see Cassandra Miller, do you want to ask your question, please?
Do we have to give her access?
Oh, do we? How do we do that?
I think I'm allowing her to talk.
Thank you both so much.
There you go.
I accidentally raised my hand, but you know what? While we're here, I need to have a question. I think one of the things that I have been wrestling with is that I am approaching this material from a classics department, and I have a hard time deciding how much to foreground the Greek and Roman material. Whether because I am offering this course, and by this course, I mean various courses within ancient medicine and ancient science and technology, whether the fact that this is coming from a classics department means that I ought to have a focus on Greek and Roman materials while also putting them in conversation with materials from other time periods, or whether an appropriate decolonization of the course would involve giving much more space to these other traditions that I confess I am at this moment not particularly expert in. So I wonder if you have some suggestions for how those of us teaching within classics programs should or might be thinking about this, and how much and in what ways to integrate this material.
I guess I'll take this. And Jay, I know that you can thank you, Cassandra, for that question. For me, I don't, I'm my job is in a classics department, and I understand kind of this idea that classics needs to be Greek and Roman, but it doesn't. Why? I would ask you to hold a more kind of baggy and capacious conception of what kind of classical studies mean. That maybe the traditional core has been kind of Greece and Rome, but I guess as an Arabist in a classical studies department, I don't feel necessarily kind of beholden necessarily to kind of just foreground those, is to think about kind of other people's kind of operating in the broad kind of pre-modern Mediterranean and Middle East. So I think, it's up to your comfort level, but I would say that to include kind of in your courses kind of more about kind of the people's, even if you want to just stay kind of in the Roman world, to look at kind of Jewish medicine and or even different indigenous traditions and Egypt. So I think if you even wanted to stay within kind of a chronology that is perhaps kind of more traditional for a classicist, that you can, focus on kind of other peoples and to perhaps kind of decenter, as Jay and I've been talking, these very kind of scholarly and very kind of elite texts that represent by Hippocrates and Galen. So I think, as classics keeps on evolving, I would say kind of, challenge what it means to be ancient. Greece and Rome doesn't necessarily have kind of the monopoly on what counts as classical and what counts as ancient, but of course it's up to what your comfort level is. So if you want to stay within kind of the chronology, like the Roman Empire or kind of classical Greece, there are other kind of cultures that you can bring into context if you do want to do kind of a more kind of narrow comparison. So I don't know, Jay, if you have any thoughts about this or not. I know that you're not kind of trained in as a classes, but whether you have any thoughts on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased here, obviously, right? So I would obviously want, more conversation to include Middle East when it comes to classics. But I think what I just want to reiterate what Eileen is saying is that if you take this broader view, more chronologically focused, then you do end up talking about some of the most important materials about medicine or science and technology that we have from the Middle East, from the Babylonian and Assyrian cultures, from Egypt, other places in North Africa. Even if you want to maintain like this notion of the Mediterranean, but I like the way you phrase that question, Cassandra, and just if we're serious about decolonizing the classics and decolonizing what it means to talk about the ancient world, then this is the work we have to do. And so even the fact that you're thinking about it says, we're working on it and we're on the right track. This is something that is very important.
Thank you both.
So sorry to interrupt again. I think someone has raised their hand. I think the listing on the Zoom is a little bit off. Is it perhaps Melina? Have you raised your hand? Are you? There's someone's listed as Cassandra and they've raised their hand and it is not Cassandra. So if you've raised your hand, I see there's Clara and someone else. Are you?
I think they took it down, so maybe we should kind of pass to kind of Clara,
okay.
Yeah, who I saw had their hand up. So please, Clara.
Hi, thank you so much. This really speaks to my current concerns and builds off of what Cassandra was saying. I'm in a classics department. I feel a moral imperative to teach ancient studies broadly, especially because there is nobody at my institution that I know of who does A&E or Egypt or ancient Africa. And something that an issue I encounter kind of regardless of the specific topic of the class, whether it's medicine or something else, is how much larger historical cultural context to bring, especially when I'm scrambling to teach myself that context, while also finding materials that are both responsible and accessible for undergraduates. So, this may be a question the answer to which is going to change a lot depending on whether you're teaching medicine versus some other cultural topic. But I'm curious how you both approach this in terms of the balance of material that you share, background versus specific content, and maybe particular resources that are particularly good for undergraduates to read about the ancient Near East broadly. Thank you again.
No, cheers, Clara. That's really one. So I'll just quickly kind of give my answer, then Jay, then I can kind of go back to kind of the Q&A. But to be honest, Clara, I don't give like loads of kind of context, when I'm doing it, because I know that, I don't have much. What I usually actually do is kind of record, I think particularly in these remote asynchronous times, like a 5-minute kind of like crash course into, ancient Egypt kind of 101 kind of, or Islamic materials, but I really kind of, more closely kind of focus on, perhaps kind of the periods and I'm doing it. And like, I don't give kind of a very extensive kind of, cultural kind of historical, background to it because I just don't have enough time. But Jay, I don't know if you're like, no, I mean, what are you doing? But, to be honest, like, I choose my battles, and focus, where I feel like I can focus on. But Jay, do you want to kind of answer that?
Yeah, I struggle with this constantly. So as I mentioned, my medicine course, for example, is the entirety of the history of the Middle East. And we initially developed this course. I did it with a medical anthropologist of the modern Middle East, my colleague Anna Vinaya, who's now at North Carolina. And this has been a constant struggle now. I've taught this course 3 different times, and every single time I try different things about contextualizing historically. So the first thing I do is that very first day, I do the entire history of the Middle East in like 20 minutes, which obviously doesn't stick, right? But it is intended to just be this very broad overview, highlighting those times that we're going to focus in on. And then I kind of just come back to it whenever whenever I'm talking about a specific theme or specific idea. So if I want to talk about Neo-Assyrian scholarship, I will take a few minutes at the beginning of that course and talk about the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the practices of collecting tablets that are in effect there, especially by kings like Ashurbanipal, to do that, because I think that is part of the story, right? So if he's collecting knowledge, and that includes medicine, like what does that mean for us as we look at all of these things? So there's a give and take for sure, and maybe I err on the side of I really want them to understand the context, but there are definitely times where I fail to do that, and they say, and they'll confuse context, especially since we're working with such a broad time span. And I think it's because of that I tend to err on, okay, let's at least touch base with where we are historically and contextually. As far as resources, sorry, for the ancient Middle East, the standard textbook is Mark van der Weerop's The Ancient Near East, till 323, so whatever it is, like 9,000 to 323, and that's from Wiley Blackwell. So that gives enough of an overview, especially, and it's geared towards students as a textbook to kind of situate them in the time and place that you might be talking about in the ancient Middle East.
Okay, so perhaps kind of the last question, because the almost at 5. Jean, do you want to kind of unmute and ask your question?
Okay, I think maybe you can hear me now.
We can, yes.
Okay, so I teach in a philosophy department. I was trained as a historian of science, and I appreciated Jay's comments about framing and the intellectual history. And let me just make a comment, and then I do have a question. The comment is that it might sometimes be helpful to use our Western point of view for comparative, history of science. For example, the idea of objectivity or types of empiricism, and then the very ancient materials actually illustrate a different kind of empiricism, so that this medicine versus magic, it sort of helps you a little bit to start overcoming that. Just an idea. But the thing I wanted to ask is, do you have contact with the science people in your universities? And I mean, I think when I try to do some of this, people think I'm like, trying to undermine science or something. Do you get that kind of lack of understanding, or is that not a problem where you are?
Yeah, I'll take this one to start off. This is a danger, right? Especially in this time and place, and it's something I've wrestled with a lot, right? So now that we're talking about cultural relativism a lot, and we're trying to talk about different forms of medical traditions and different forms of medical practices, and in a way, thinking a lot about the very foundations of science in this class. I've wrestled a lot with how do we do that without undermining trust in science. And dealt with that a lot this past year in teaching my medicine course. One of the ways I've done that is our colleague here at Michigan, Henry Coles, just wrote this wonderful book, Historicizing the Scientific Method, and thinking about the context and ways that the scientific method is talked about and mythologized. And that was a good way for me to get my students thinking about science in a different way. And then I come back and just and say, I'm not trying to undermine your trust in the CDC or anything like that. That's very important for us here and now. But we need to recognize why we're in this space, right? So I try to historicize us just as much as I historicize and relativize and culturize the ancient Middle East. So that's kind of my way of working at it, is to is to ask the questions about science, ask the questions about rationality, and then give them the tools they need to reaffirm why and how we think about science the way we do. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jay, for doing that. So I think we might, sorry, I'm just doing it. We might kind of wrap things up here because it's 2 past the hour. And I know that everybody is probably kind of, well, at least us at Michigan, where it's exam time. And so it's like, but thank you everyone for answering your questions. I've just put, for asking your questions. And I hope that this was useful to some of you. So Jay and I have both kind of put kind of forms of contact if you would like to get in touch with us, you know, to ask kind of more pointed questions, and we can try to steer you as much as we can. So I put my email, and then Jay's on, you know, Twitter. So please get in touch with us. And thank you so much kind of for showing up and for, you know, showing commitment to, you know, embracing a more expansive vision of what an STS course can be. So I don't know, Colin, if you want to wrap anything up or just go toodaloo.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is I mentioned it in the chat, but just to reiterate it, I've been frantically writing all of the resources that have been mentioned. So we'll try to compile a more or less comprehensive list of what we've discussed and post it on the SAM website. There should be a video, if everything goes smoothly, of this event that we'll also post there. So if you're interested in some of the resources, hopefully they'll be all pre-packaged for you on our website. And if not, then you can contact Eileen or Jay for specifics if we've missed something.
All right, thank you. Cheers, everyone. Enjoy Earth Day, and kind of if it's sunny where you're out, get outside and get some vitamin D. All right, folks. Bye.
Thank you all.